Part 2, Chapter 8. Would Bassem and Latif and all those other boys have done what they did in Daraa if they'd realised that they were lighting a fuse that would explode into total war? I don't know. I tried to ask Musa the other day, but he just scowled at me. Maybe one day we'll be able to talk about it. Daraa is such an ordinary place when we first went to live there. The pavements were crowded with shoppers, the streets were full of traffic, and there were all the usual things that make up a city. Shops, schools, hospitals, mosques, church. But a few months later, it was all wrecked. Ruined. Dead. I suppose looking back that it happened quite quickly. Moving from those first scrawled slogans on school walls to full-scale disaster only took a few weeks. But during those weeks' time, just crawled by. There were demonstrations and marches by the angry people of Daraa all the time. The tickly smell of tear gas often hung over the city, and the streets from away you could hear the shouts of the marchers. We sacrifice our blood and our souls. We are no longer afraid. God, Syria, freedom. The police and army fired on the demonstrators time after time. Terrorists, they called them. It's what Baba called them too. But Bassem and Latif and Musa weren't terrorists. They just wanted to live in a country where they didn't have to be afraid all the time. They wanted a government that was fair-minded and open. The day after every march, there would be funerals. Furious men and boys would tramp down the streets, carrying coffins shoulder-high and shouting so loud that everyone could probably hear them over 100 kilometres away in Damascus. Yet, it still didn't seem real until Musa got a text on his old phone. We'd finished supper and I was playing a silly clapping game with Nadia, putting off the moment when I'd started to do my homework. Musa made a sort of gurgling noise as he looked down at the tiny screen. "What?" I demanded. "You sounded like a frog in a swamp." I was annoyed with him because he'd refused to do my homework. He'd even given me a lecture on how I'd never learn anything if I didn't do the work myself. He looked too shocked to speak. His hand jerked violently and the phone flew out of it. I lunged for it before he could get it, then had to read the words 3 times before they sank in. Latif, shot in the head, died in hospital just now. Funeral tomorrow. "It's not true," I said, my voice going horribly wobbly. "Bassem's having you on." But it was true, and we both knew it. I think I grew up a little bit after Latif died. It wasn't as if he'd actually been my friend. I'd only met him a couple of times, but whenever I hear the deaths of resistance fighters, I think of Latif standing beside Bassem at the school entrance, Latif running through the back streets of Daraa with Nadia in his arms, Latif on the edge of his chair in our flat in his crisp white shirt, listening respectfully to Baba, Latif almost dropping the mobile phone folded inside my comic. Until Latif died, there'd been a ding-dong battle going on in my head. I'd hear Musa's voice talking passionately about our wicked regime, our police state, the repression, corruption, and all the rest of it. And then Latif would butt in with the voice of our president, droning on about foreign powers, conspiracies, and Syria going through a test of unity. And there was always Baba's harsh voice, preaching about law and order and teaching hotheads a lesson. After Latif's funeral, I didn't know that I wanted to listen to any of their voices anymore. Maybe I'm a coward for fighting, but it just wasn't for me, that. And dying isn't for me either. I'm not brave like Musa. I don't understand what's really going on, who's right, who's wrong, who's good and who's bad. I just want things to go back to the way they were before, but I know they never will. For a while, we all tried to go on doing normal things. Bab went to work at the ministry and Ma looked after Nadia, did everything around the house and tried to put up with Granny. We all went to school and, as usual, there was no peace for me at home, because every time I tried to do something on my own, Ma sent me out to buy something at a shop or made me water Granny's horrible plants. Nothing was really the same though. Baba seemed to hate his new job and he came home every day in just an awful temper. He was all knotted up inside and flared up over the slightest thing. And Ma had the worst of it. She'd bought a flowery patterned hijab and spent hours gazing in the mirror, fixing it in place with a little pearl-headed pin. I thought it looked nice and fashionable, but when Baba saw her coming home from school in it, he went crazy. "Are you trying to shame me?" he yelled. "Is this a respectable family or—" I won't repeat the rest. Musa was hardly ever around. At night, when he'd crept home at last and thought he was asleep, I'd pester him to tell me what was going on, and he'd just shrug and pretend he hadn't heard. "You don't trust me. You think I'm just a little kid," I'd snarl at him. "So who risked his neck to get that phone back for you, hey? Who?" "Give it a rest, Omar," he'd say, brushing me off as if I was a fly buzzing round his head. "You don't feel about it the way that I feel about these things, do you?" "You don't know what I feel." "Yes, I do. And you? Are you prepared to die? To free Syria from tyranny? Are you willing to go to prison and be tortured?" That silenced me. I wasn't at all willing, and we both knew it. Be a martyr, I'd say. See if I care. I knew I'd sounded like a sulky kid, but I'd have sounded sillier if I'd said what I really wanted to do. I really, really don't want you to die, Musa. I think you're awesome. I actually love you, you know. One good thing was the change that had come over Granny. She'd never given Uncle Faisal and Auntie Madja for locking her out of the flat that day. To get back at them, she'd started being really nice to Ma. After a while, I could tell that she wasn't playing a game anymore. They began to spend hours together in the kitchen, gossiping. She was as shocked as the rest of us when Latif was killed. That nice boy, she kept saying, so respectful. These soldiers, who do they think they are, shooting innocent boys like that? When Baba started with his usual tirade about strong government and law and order, she started everyone by saying, "You've got your head in the clouds as usual, Hamid. That boy Musa knows what's going on. He's got more sense than you ever had, and even he is a cripple." I was just as well that peace had broken out at home, because outside in the city, things were getting more and more scary. Rumours flew around like demented crows. Granny stood for hours on the landing outside our front door, ranting on with our ancient neighbour about the damage the government troops had been done to the famous old mosque in the middle of town. Aman and her pink mobile constantly clamped to her ear as she and her friends debated whether or not it was safe to go to school. Baba came home every evening raging about the insolence of the youths who had been pulling down portraits of the presidents on government buildings. Even Floyd came running in from playing in the yard with garbled stories about other kids, older brothers who had disappeared. It wasn't easy to work out what was true and what wasn't. There was no point in watching the news on TV either, unless, like Baba, you wanted to listen to a lot of hot air and lies. Musa, of course, said nothing at all. He'd acquired another smartphone given to him by Sen, I assumed. He spent hours on it surfing the web and tapping out emails and texts. And then, quite suddenly, the authorities cut off the internet. It was the weirdest thing being without it. It feels as if we were living on a desert island. Without it, there was no way of finding out what was happening in the rest of the country. There was no social media, no ways to keep in touch with friends, nowhere to look for information, no news. I minded less than Aman and Musa. The only person I wanted to be in touch with was Rasul. But although I'd kept sending him messages on my beaten-up old phone, he hardly ever answered. He'd managed to get as far as Germany, I knew that much, and he decided to go on to Norway. It's surprising how quickly you can get used to these things. Demonstrations, marches, shootings and funerals, they all started to feel like a normal part of life. I'd go to school every day, and sometimes the gates would be open, and I'd have to endure boring lessons and kicks from stupid Farid. But on other days, the gates would be closed, and we'd all drift off home again. I didn't think about where it was all heading. Even if I had, I'd never have guessed in a million years what the government would do next. I wasn't feeling well the day the tanks rolled into Daraa. It was the end of April, and the weather was getting hotter all the time. And Mum was at home. Baba had forbidden her to go outside, and anyway, the girls' school had been closed for days. Fowd and Musa had gone off to see if the boys' school were open, but I used my horrible cough as an excuse to stay home. The boys had only been gone an hour when they came hurrying home, with Baba right behind them. Ma came out of the kitchen holding Nadia in her arms. "What's happening? Why have you all come back?" "It's a showdown," Baba said shortly. "The terrorists." I saw Musa wince at the word. "Have taken over the old mosque, and the government have sent troops in to flush them out. They've sent tanks in." "Tanks," Musa said savagely. "They've started shelling the mosque." Granny had come out of the kitchen too. She looked scandalised. "They're shooting at the great mosque with tank shells." She clapped her hands to the side of her face. "Ya haram! Allah will punish them for this." "Don't talk about things you don't know anything about," Baba said shortly. "Aman looked after your little sister, Layla. You'll have to come out shopping with me. Bring bags. We need to stock up as much as we can on food. Omar, stop pretending to be ill and come with us. We might have a lot to carry." Outside in the street, you could almost smell the panic in the air. Cars crammed with people were trying to carve through the traffic, their roof racks weighed down with mattresses and bulging bags, their drivers furiously sounding their horns. Only some of the food shops had stayed open, and they were crammed with people desperately buying everything that they could lay their hands on. Some things had sold out, but before we could get to them, however, we still managed to fill our bags with stuff like dried lentils, flour, rice, tea, cooking oil and cheese. I tried to sneak in a few candy bars, but Baba slapped my hands down. I heaved a great sigh of relief when we were safely back indoors. It was hard to tell where the tanks were, but I kept thinking, as we ran out from one shop to another, that at any moment one would appear at the end of the street and blast us all to pieces. I don't know if you've ever heard the rumble of tanks coming down a city street. They make an incredible noise. It's not only the deafening engines, it's the sound of their caterpillar tracks churning up the tarmac and the crunch of metal on broken glass as they knock down streetlights. And that is before their guns start to fire. When they do, the booming crash is so frightening that you stand paralysed for a moment, then dash as fast as you can to any shelter you can find. That day, when the siege of Daraa began, what was then knots in my stomach began to tighten. It was the day when I started to feel truly afraid. And that night, and for nights after, I couldn't get to sleep. And when I did drop off, I had terrible dreams. Late in the afternoon, after the longest day I could ever remember, there were shouts in the street below and loud, banging noises. Musa and I crawled out onto the balcony to peer through the jungle of plants. "Get back in here," shrieked Ma. "Do you want to be shot?" We didn't need to be told twice. Anyway, we'd seen enough. The banging sounds were rifle butts pounding on doors, and the men doing the pounding were soldiers. "They're doing house-to-house searches," Musa said, his face suddenly pale. "Omar, you've got to help me." My heart gave a sickening thump. "It's that phone, isn't it? That stupid phone!" "Not just that." He was fumbling in his trouser pocket and pulled out a little notebook with a red cover. He held it out to me. I jumped back. I felt as if he was handing me a poisonous steak. "No," was all I managed to say. "No." He thrust it at me. His jerky spasms always got worse when he was nervous, and now his hands were flailing all over the place. When I didn't move away, he turned. "All right, I'll hide them myself." The shouts and bangs began to get closer. Musa lost control of the book, which I flopped out of his grasp and onto the floor. Reluctantly, I picked it up. "Where?" I said shortly. "Under your mattress." "Too easy. Flush it down the toilet." "Take too long." "I'll chuck it out the window at the back," I said, making for the bathroom door. "Wait!" He clutched my arm. "Sub-ta-fa." I may be the world's most brilliant expert in understanding Musa, but no one could have cracked that. "Subterfuge." I was dancing with impatience. "Stop trying to impress me with long words. There's no time. What does subterfuge mean?" "Trick them. Only way. Stuff it into your pile of school notebooks." "Your school notebooks, you mean?" Yes, mine. Quick, stick a label on the cover. They're on the shelf by my pencil case. Write physics notes on it. Hide it between the others." I flicked quickly through the notebook. It was filled with jottings, listings of numbers and weird words in Musa's terrible handwriting. I was pretty sure that even if the soldiers found it, they wouldn't be able to read it. "What about the phone?" "Leave it to me." I dashed into our room, and a moment later, the notebook had its new label and was tucked in amongst Musa's other books. As I came out of our room, a deafening noise sent my hair standing up from its roots. The soldiers had reached our building and were battering on the street door downstairs. Baba hurried to our own front door and pressed the buzzer to let them in. Musa wasn't in the sitting room. I rushed to the kitchen. Ma was handing strips of sticky tape up to Aman, who was standing on the chair by the window, taping crisscross patterns with them across the glass. Granny was by the table feeding biscuits to Nadia with trembling fingers. "Omar, come and help your sis," began Ma, but I'd backed out of the kitchen before she had time to finish. I could hear raised voices from below, then heavy footsteps running up the stairs. I stood, frozen, watching Baba, who was standing by the open front door, looking out into the landing with a sheaf of papers in his hands. Musa come out of Granny and Aman's bedroom. "Have you hidden it?" I hissed at him. He had time to nod, then the soldiers were at our door. Musa leaned against me, going floppy. He put his head on one side and smiled vacantly. I willed him not to take it too far and start dribbling. Baba was talking calmly to a couple of soldiers, showing them his papers. "You see, sir, Ministry of Agriculture. I'm a government employee. You wish to search our flat?" "Of course." "You have to do your duty." He turned and saw us standing by the kitchen door. "Omar, Musa, show these gentlemen whatever they want to see." It was impossible to read the expression in the two soldiers' eyes, which was shaded by their military helmets. They glanced quickly from Musa to me, then at Foyt, who was peeping nervously at them from behind the sofa. "Other family," one of them barked. "My wife, mother, and 2 daughters, Baba said with an anxious smile. "Where?" "In the kitchen." A shouted command came from the bottom of the stairwell. One of the soldiers pushed past Baba. He hurried round the room, opening door after door, and looked quickly inside. There was a muffled scream from a man and an angry outburst from Granny when he looked into the kitchen. He shut the door again quickly and hurried back out into the landing, pushing past Baba without another word. As their boots went clattering noisily down the concrete stairs, Baba called out after them, "Inshallah, you will be successful in your good work, rooting out." I could tell he was winding himself up to make one of his pompous speeches. The men didn't bother to wait. We turned the corner of the stairwell, and a moment later, we heard the metal street door clang shut behind them. Musa had dropped his play acting as soon as they were out of sight, and had slipped back into the granny's bedroom. He came out a moment later with the phone in his hand. Ma opened the kitchen door cautiously and peered down. "It's all right," she said over her shoulder to the others in the kitchen. "They've gone." Granny came out after her. "Outrageous," she croaked. "Those men ogling my granddaughter in her own home with her hair uncovered." They didn't have time to ogle Granny, said Imam. They looked like a couple of frightened rabbits at the sight of a room full of women. She was the boldest of all of us in talking back to Granny, and I noticed that Granny seemed to like it. They were only doing their duty, Baba said stiffly. I told them I worked for the government. They saw at once that I wasn't the kind of man to allow subversive activities in my family. Musa had gone into our bedroom. I hurried after him. He was looking for his little red book. Where did you hide the phone? I asked him. He grinned at me. It's Granny's underwear drawer. You didn't. She'd kill you if she finds out. She won't. Anyway, I reckon she deserves it. Do you think I like being called a cripple all the time by my own grandmother? I saw it in my mind's eyes. Musa's phone. That little stick of revolutionary dynamite filled with who knows what, and photos and incriminating messages and hiding amongst Granny's big black knickers and armour-plated corsets. Musa and I stared at each other. Then we fell onto our beds and stuffed our pillows into our mouths to muffle out shrieks of laughter.